The Zyrinthian Sovereignty did not believe in myths. They believed in spreadsheets, kinetic energy, and the absolute dominance of their 3-meter-tall armored frames. When their scout ship, the Radiant Scythe, picked up a life sign on the desolate frozen moon of Frost 7, Commander Vol expected to find a mining robot or a derelict drone. Instead, he found a human. The man, Caleb Voss, was sitting on a porch made of salvaged starship plating, wrapped in a tattered thermal cloak. Beside him sat a creature of bone and muscle, covered in thick, dark fur with eyes that reflected the starlight. A dog named Bones. Human. Vol boomed through his suit's external speakers, his 4 mandibles clicking in the rhythmic disdain the galaxy reserved for the janitors of the stars. Humans were the species that took the jobs no one else wanted, established colonies on Deathworlds that would kill a Zyrinthian in minutes, and always apologized for the inconvenience. "You are in violation of Sector Ordinance 402, Vol stated. "This moon is now Zyrinthian property. Your biological asset, the tracker, is to be confiscated for Imperial study." Caleb Voss didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even stand up. He just looked at the dog, then back at the commander. "He's not a tracker," Caleb said. His voice was soft, possessing that exhausted certainty common among humans who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. "His name is Bones. He's my friend. We aren't bothering you." "A friend?" Vol's secondary stomach churned with a gurgling laugh. "Our sensors show this creature has a sensory range that exceeds our best tactical arrays. It is a biological masterpiece, a weapon. It belongs to the Sovereignty now." As the Zyrinthian guard stepped forward, Caleb Voss let out a long, slow sigh. "Humans have stages of behavior, Commander," he said, his eyes turning as hard as the permafrost beneath his boots. "Stage 1 is being polite. We're very good at it. It's a choice we make because we know what happens when we stop." Vol ignored the warning. He watched as his guards used a gravity-clamping snare to pin Bones to the ground. The dog let out a sharp, pained whimper, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very hull of the Zyrinthian ship. Caleb's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, but he didn't strike. He simply watched as Bones was hauled into a containment pod. "You just skipped straight to the end of my patience," Caleb whispered. "Be grateful we leave you your life, primate." Vol sneered as the dropship's ramp hissed shut. The Radiant Scythe ascended, its engines scorching the frozen ground, leaving Caleb Voss alone in the sub-zero wind. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man who was about to prove that a human's patience was the only thing keeping the galaxy from burning. He walked back into his shack and tapped a sequence into a concealed, high-frequency transmitter. "This is Voss," he said. The voice on the other end was silent, waiting. "The Zyrinthians took him. They're heading for the Aurelian hub." "Understood, Caleb," a voice replied, cold and metallic. "Is the back row authorized to engage?" Caleb looked at the empty space on the porch where Bones used to sit. "Not yet," he said, his eyes reflecting the cold blue of the moon. "I'm going to walk through their front door first. I want to give them one last chance to do the right thing before I remind them why Earth was classified as a nightmare." The Aurelian hub was a monument to the Zyrinthian Sovereignty's obsession with scale and order. It was a massive, multi-ringed station that served as the heartbeat of the sector, where the superior species gathered to partition resources and debate the fates of lesser worlds. When a beat-up, oxygen-leaking freighter requested a landing pad, the docking officers didn't even raise an eyebrow. They assumed it was just another janitor ship, a human contractor delivering basic supplies or hauling away the station's waste. Caleb Voss stepped off the ramp, his grease-stained flight suit a stark contrast to the gleaming obsidian floors of the concourse. He walked with a quiet, measured stride that ignored the towering holographic statues of Zyrinthian conquerors. To the thousands of aliens bustling through the hub, he was invisible. A primate from a backwater world, serving a species that only existed in the back row of galactic society. At the security desk of the central spire, a Zyrinthian clerk with 4 eyes and shimmering scales looked up with bored contempt. "The maintenance entrance is 3 levels down, human. You're in the wrong sector." "I'm not here for the vents," Caleb said, his voice possessing a calm, exhausted politeness that made the clerk's secondary stomach twitch. "I'm here for Bones. Your scout ship took him from Frost 7. I've come to collect him." The clerk froze, his mandibles clicking in a wave of disbelief before erupting into a gurgling laugh. "You came to the Sector High Command to retrieve a confiscated bio-asset? Primate, that creature is currently being prepared for neural mapping in the upper labs." Caleb didn't flinch. He simply placed a small, worn leather collar on the counter. Humans have stages of behavior, and I'm currently in stage 1, he said softly, his eyes reflecting the cold lights of the station. Stage 1 is being polite. We show our teeth in smiles, we wait in lines, and we ask for what's ours with table manners. The clerk's laughter died as he caught Caleb's gaze. There was something in the human's expression that bypassed the alien's logical processing and struck a primitive chord of survival instinct. It was the look of a predator that had evolved on a Class 12 death world, a creature that had spent millennia perfecting the art of saving it for when it's necessary. If I have to move to stage 2, Caleb continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry through the entire concourse, you're going to find out why the back row is the most dangerous place in the room. High above, in a chamber of reinforced glass, High Arbiter Thrax watched the security feed. He was a being who viewed humans as a convenient myth, a species too soft for the true violence of the stars. He came alone? Thrax asked, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Yes, Arbiter, a tactical officer replied. He's standing at the desk, politely threatening the entire station staff. Thrax laughed, a sound like grinding stones. Bring him up. Bring? I want to see the face of a man who thinks he can negotiate for a wolf's soul. Let him watch the extraction. It will be an educational experience. As the elevator hissed open to receive him, Caleb Voss didn't reach for a weapon. He simply nodded to a human janitor who was mopping the floor nearby. The janitor didn't speak, but he tightened his grip on the handle of his mop, his eyes following Caleb with a loyalty that had no record in the Sovereignty's databases. Caleb stepped into the lift, the doors closing on a concourse that was about to realize it had just let the most dangerous thing in the galaxy walk through its front door. The elevator doors opened to a chamber that felt more like a tomb than a court. High Arbiter Thrax sat upon a throne of obsidian, his 4 eyes gleaming with the same clinical coldness as the stars. Around him, a dozen Zyrinthian elites stood as silent statues, their heavy plating absorbing the neon glow of the lab monitors flickering in the background. So, this is the primate who walks into the heart of the Sovereignty to demand the return of a bioasset, Thrax said, his voice a gurgling rumble of amusement. He gestured with a clawed hand toward a massive holographic screen. It showed Bones restrained in a neural cradle, surrounded by buzzing drones and surgical lasers. Caleb Voss stood in the center of the hall, his boots caked with the red dust of a moon they had already forgotten. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a weary man in a grease-stained flight suit who had simply lost his way. I didn't come here to argue, Arbiter, Caleb said, his voice possessing that smooth, calm accent that usually preceded a tragedy. I came to give you the chance to fix a mistake before it becomes a catastrophe. Thrax leaned forward, his mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter. Mistake? The extraction of the creature's neural architecture will take exactly 7 hours. We will strip its sensory patterns and synthesize them into our own tactical arrays. You humans call it a friend, but we see it for what it truly is. An apex biological tracker from a Class 12 death world. Caleb didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply looked at the screen where Bones was whining, a sound that made the air in the room feel heavy. You see a weapon? Caleb whispered. Because you spent 300 years thinking this was evidence of absence. You assumed we were the galaxy's janitors because we were patient. You forgot that we chose diplomacy because cooperation was more profitable than the alternative. Thrax's amusement faded, replaced by a sharp, predatory irritation. Your alternative is what, primate? You have no fleet in this sector. You have no weapons. You are a story parents tell their spawn to make them behave, nothing more. Caleb Voss took a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, clean cloth, and began to wipe a smudge of grease from his hand with a focus that was utterly terrifying. The smile he offered Thrax didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that showed far too many teeth. A primal threat display masquerading as a greeting. I'm currently in stage 1 of human behavior, Caleb said softly. That's the stage where we ask nicely and follow your protocols. But humans are apex predators who just happen to have table manners. We learned long ago that peace is a choice that only works when everyone chooses it. He folded the cloth and looked Thrax directly in all 4 eyes. Now, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the Zyrinthian guards shift their weight in sudden, instinctive unease. I'm actually getting annoyed. The temperature in the sanctum seemed to drop 10 degrees. At that exact moment, the holographic screen behind Thrax didn't just flicker. It turned a deep, warning crimson as every sensor on the Aurelian hub began to scream in a language the Zyrinthians hadn't heard in centuries. Total system failure. The silence that followed Caleb's statement was not the quiet of a room, but the vacuum of a collapse. High Arbiter Thrax stared at the human, his four eyes blinking in a sequence of genuine confusion, a biological tell that his species was struggling to process a sudden shift in the food chain. On the walls, the holographic displays of Imperial glory flickered and died, replaced by a scrolling terminal of human-designed code that moved too fast for the Zyrinthian processors to intercept. "What is this?" Thrax demanded, his voice cracking as the gravity in the sanctum fluctuated, making his heavy armor feel momentarily weightless. "A cyber attack? You think a few corrupted files will stop the extraction?" Caleb didn't answer with words. He simply looked at his timepiece. Across the Aurelian hub, the transformation began. In the docking bays, the human janitors, who had spent decades mopping floors and hauling waste, stopped mid-motion. They didn't run. They reached into their toolkits and pulled out specialized encryption spikes and pulse emitters disguised as cleaning supplies. In the communications hub, the low-level clerks who had been ignored for years quietly locked the doors and began rerouting the station's defensive grid to point inward. "This is the Annoyance Protocol," Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm amid the blaring alarms. "You've spent 73 cycles treating us like your personal crisis management service. Assuming our patience was a lack of capability, you thought we were the janitors because we were soft. You never stopped to ask why we wanted the back row seats." Thrax slammed a clawed fist onto his obsidian throne, but the surface, usually indestructible, shattered under a localized high-frequency vibration Caleb had triggered with a tap on his wrist link. "Security! Execute the primate!" The Zyrinthian elite guards lunged, their 3-meter frames moving with the speed of trained predators. But as they crossed the floor, the janitor Caleb had nodded to earlier, a man who had been mopping the floor just outside the chamber, vaulted through the doorway. He didn't use a rifle. He used a high-tensile gravity wire to trip the lead guard, sending 1,200 pounds of armored alien crashing into the wall with a sound like a ship's hull breaching. 14.3 seconds, the janitor remarked, checking a data slate as he stood beside Caleb. "The tactical team is ahead of schedule. The neural labs are dark, and the extraction has been terminated." Caleb looked at Thrax, whose scales were turning a pale, sickly orange, the Zyrinthian equivalent of total existential dread. "We didn't become a spacefaring species by accident," Caleb whispered, stepping over the fallen guard. "We've been practicing violence far longer than we've been practicing diplomacy. We saved it. We saved it for when it was necessary. And right now, taking Bones back is very necessary." Outside the observation window, the starlight began to distort. It wasn't the station's engines, it was something else. Thousands of ripples in space-time appearing in a perfect, suffocating circle around the hub. Thrax's tactical officer gasped, his hands trembling over a dead console. "Arbiter, the sensor ghosts, they aren't ghosts anymore. They're hot. Everything is going hot. From the cold vacuum where the Sovereignty's scanners had reported nothing but space dust, a ghost fleet of human warships began to decloak, their weapon locks painting the Aurelian hub with a lethal, shimmering glow. "I told you," Caleb said, his shadow stretching long across the deck as the emergency red lighting took over. "You skipped straight to the end of my patience." Thrax watched in horror as his elite guards were neutralized not by heavy weapons, but by high-tensile wires and precise strikes from the very people who had mopped his floors for decades. The janitor standing beside Caleb, a man named Elias, casually checked his data slate as the station's internal defensive grids finished reorienting to point directly at the Zyrinthian command staff. "You don't understand," Thrax stammered, his four eyes twitching as the gravity became dangerously unstable. "You are nothing. You are the service staff, the support class." "That's exactly what we wanted you to think," Elias replied, his voice carrying the same unsettling calm as Caleb's. He explained that humans specifically chose the back row of galactic society because it provided the best sight lines and perspective. While the Sovereignty was busy performing for the front seats of power, the humans were in the back, mapping every security flaw, social dynamic, and industrial weakness. For 73 cycles, humanity had played the role of the galaxy's janitors, taking the dangerous, dirty jobs no one else wanted while silently studying their neighbors. They had spent years perfecting the art of saving it for when it was necessary, and Thrax's decision to confiscate Bones had finally provided that necessity. "You see, Arbiter, we've been counting your response times for years," Elias added, pointing to the red alerts on the walls. "We know exactly how fast you move when you're scared, And more importantly, we know exactly where your systems are blind. Caleb Voss stepped toward the viewing port, looking out at the ghost fleet that now surrounded the hub. The human ships moved with an eerie, coordinated grace that defied Zyrinthian physics, each one knowing exactly where the others would be. They weren't just a military force. They were a pack of predators that had been waiting for the signal to strike. "You thought we were the help," Caleb whispered, his gaze turning to the neural labs where Bones had been restrained. But we were just the only ones in the room who saw the reality instead of the show. The station shuddered violently as a boarding craft from the Ghost Fleet slammed into the lab's exterior hull with surgical precision. "Bones is moving," Elias noted, his slate glowing. "But we have another problem, Caleb. The Sovereignty just sent a distress signal on a subquantum frequency. They aren't calling for a retreat, they're calling for the planet Cracker." The command deck of the Aurelian hub was no longer a place of imperial governance. It had become a theater of clinical, terrifying efficiency. High Arbiter Thrax watched, paralyzed, as his screens flickered with data streams that weren't just bypassing his firewalls. They were rewriting the very architecture of his civilization's logic. Beside him, the human named Elias was tapping a rhythm on his data slate, his face illuminated by the crimson glow of the station's dying power grid. "The distress signal reached the void render," Elias said, his voice devoid of any panic. "The Zyrinthian planet Cracker is jumping into the system. It'll be here in precisely 4 minutes. They've decided that if they can't own this sector, nobody will." Thrax's mandibles twitched. "You think your ghost fleet can stand against a world killer? The void render doesn't fire projectiles, primate. It collapses the Higgs field. It turns reality into a singularity. You and your flea-ridden beast will be nothing but compressed atoms before the hour is out." Caleb Voss didn't look at the Arbiter. He was watching the tactical overlay. "You still don't get it, Thrax. You're playing a game of checkers against a species that invented the board, the pieces, and the gravity in the room. You think that signal was a cry for help? We let that signal out." Caleb turned and began walking toward the heavy blast doors leading to the research sector. "Elias, keep the Arbiter comfortable. I'm going to get my dog." As Caleb moved through the corridors, the station's internal defenses, the high-powered plasma turrets and automated sentries, didn't fire at him. Instead, they swiveled to track the Zyrinthian soldiers who were scrambling to regroup. The back row had done more than just disable the locks. They had subverted the station's very soul. Human janitors and maintenance crews emerged from the shadows, stripped of their jumpsuits to reveal tactical underarmor. They moved with a silent, lethal grace that suggested they weren't just soldiers. They were ghosts who had been haunting the Sovereignty for 100 years. Caleb reached the neural mapping lab. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and sterilized metal. In the center of the room, Bones was still strapped into the cradle. The black dog's ears perked up at the sound of Caleb's boots. A low, hopeful whine broke the silence of the lab. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered, his hands moving over the console with a speed that spoke of a deep, forgotten history in systems engineering. "I told you I was coming back." He didn't just hit a button. He executed a sequence of commands that would have taken a Zyrinthian technician hours to decode. The gravity snares hissed as they retracted, and Bones leaped from the table, nearly knocking Caleb over with a frantic, tail-wagging greeting. Caleb buried his hand in the dog's thick fur for a brief second, his face softening. "Pal, let's go home." But as they turned to leave, the station groaned. A vibration so deep it rattled Caleb's teeth, shook the foundations of the hub. The starlight outside the lab windows began to warp and stretch, turning into an impossible, jagged violet. The void render had arrived. It was a monstrosity of geometry, a ship the size of a moon, shaped like a shattered diamond. It didn't have engines in the traditional sense. It seemed to tear its way through the fabric of space. It loomed over the hub, its primary aperture beginning to glow with a light that felt wrong to look at. Caleb's wrist comm crackled. It was Elias. "Caleb, the planet Cracker is spinning up. The Zyrinthian High Command just gave the order to fire. They're targeting the hub first to eliminate the human leadership before they glass the surrounding systems." "Is the accountant ready?" Caleb asked, his voice hardening as he led Bones back toward the command deck. "He's been ready for 3 decades, Elias replied. "The Sovereignty bought their targeting CPUs from a third-party merchant in the Orion Nebula 50 years ago. They didn't realize that the merchant was a front for a human shell company. We didn't just sell them the hardware, Caleb. We sold them the back door." On the command deck, Thrax was screaming at his officers, demanding a status update. "Fire! Why haven't they fired yet?" "The targeting system it's locked, Arbiter," the officer wailed. It's not targeting the hub, it's recalibrating. Targeting what? Thrax roared. Caleb Voss walked back onto the deck, Bones trotting calmly at his side. He looked at the holographic display. The Void Render's primary weapon wasn't pointed at the station anymore. It was swiveling slowly and inexorably toward the Zyrinthian homeworld's primary sun. We don't just write stories, Thrax, Caleb said, his voice echoing in the sudden, terrified silence of the room. We hijack the world's attention, and right now, we have the undivided attention of your entire empire. The Void Render fired, but it wasn't a beam of destruction. It was a pulse of pure, encoded data, a signal that began to broadcast every single secret, every hidden atrocity, and every financial lie the Sovereignty had ever committed, directly into the neural nets of every citizen in the Empire. What have you done? Thrax whispered, his scales turning a dead, ashen gray. I told you, Caleb said, patting Bones' head. I was getting annoyed, but you should see what happens when the rest of humanity finds out what you were planning to do to my dog. The starlight outside shifted again. A second fleet decloaked. These ships weren't human, and they weren't the Ghost Fleet. They were something much older, and they looked very hungry. The air in the command sanctum of the Aurelian hub was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, electric hum of the Void Render's aborted firing sequence. High Arbiter Thrax stood frozen, his four eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the tactical display. The second fleet, the one that had just materialized from the empty space behind the Zyrinthian homeworld, was not composed of the sleek modern warships of the Ghost Fleet. These ships were massive, jagged slabs of dark matter and reinforced tungsten, looking more like floating mountains than vessels of war. They bore the insignia of the Old Earth Vanguard, a title that existed only in the most forbidden, dusty corners of galactic archives. You said you were a young species, Thrax whispered, his primary mandibles trembling. The records said humanity was a Tier 1 emergent civilization, a peaceful race of builders and service providers. Caleb Voss sat on the edge of the shattered obsidian throne, his hand resting calmly on Bones' head. The dog leaned against his leg, a silent, powerful presence that seemed to anchor the entire room. Records are written by the survivors, Thrax, Caleb said, his voice echoing with a weight that felt centuries old. And we've been surviving for a very long time. We didn't emerge into the galaxy. We retreated from it. We fought a war 10,000 years ago that nearly turned the Milky Way into a graveyard. When it was over, we decided to be different. We chose the back row because we wanted to see if the rest of you could do better than we did. He stood up, walking toward the massive observation window. Outside, the jagged human supercarriers were moving with a slow, terrifying inevitability, their gravitational anchors tugging at the hub's structural integrity. You call Earth a Class 12 death world because of the gravity, the radiation, and the weather. Caleb continued, gesturing to the stars. But you never understood the biological reality of it. Everything on our planet is built to kill or be killed. We grew up in a slaughterhouse. And in that nightmare, we found one ally. One species that looked at the madness of Earth and decided to walk beside us. He looked down at Bones, whose dark eyes were fixed on the High Arbiter. We didn't domesticate dogs, Thrax. We formed a pact of blood and bone. We took the wolf, the most efficient, relentless pack hunter on our planet, and we invited it to our fire. We gave it our food, and it gave us its soul. In return, we promised that no harm would ever come to them. It is the oldest, most sacred contract in human history. It is the foundation of our civilization. Caleb turned back to Thrax, and for the first time, his gaze was not just annoyed, it was predatory. You broke that contract. You looked at a creature that has been our brother for 10 millennia, and you saw a bio-asset to be disassembled for parts. You didn't just insult a human. You insulted the pact that defines our species. The station's communication system suddenly erupted into a cacophony of voices. Thousands of Zyrinthian citizens were screaming across the open channels, their worlds thrown into chaos by the data pulse. The back row humans on every planet had already seized the broadcast hubs, showing the entire empire the footage of Bones being tortured in the neural cradle. The Zyrinthian public, seeing the cruelty of their leaders through the eyes of the very janitors they had ignored, was revolting in real time. The sovereignty is over, Elias said from the side, his data slate showing the collapse of the imperial currency. The accountant has finished the audit. Your empire is bankrupt, your military is paralyzed, and your people are currently tearing down the statues of your ancestors. Thrax collapsed to his knees, his armor clattering against the deck. All of this for a beast? You destroyed 1,000 years of progress for a creature that licks its own paws? Caleb walked to the center of the deck, picking up the worn leather collar he had left there earlier. He knelt down and buckled it around Bones' neck with careful, steady hands. "It was never about the beast, Thrax," Caleb said, looking at the broken arbiter. "It was about the fact that you thought you were powerful enough to take what was ours without consequence. You mistook our patience for weakness. You mistook our silence for submission." Suddenly, the station lurched. A proximity alarm one the humans hadn't subverted began to blare. A rogue Zyrinthian commander, desperate and seeing no way out, had overridden the manual controls of a heavy ordnance ship docked in the lower ring. He wasn't aiming for the human fleet. He was aiming for the hub's primary reactor. "If I die, we all die!" The commander's voice screamed over the intercom. Caleb didn't blink. He just looked at the ceiling. "Elias, tell the Vanguard we're done being patient." The rogue Zyrinthian cruiser, the Vengeance of Zyle, was a streak of desperate fire, screaming toward the Aurelian hub's primary reactor core. Its engines were redlining, screaming in a frequency that sounded like a dying god. The rogue commander, blinded by the collapse of his world, was intent on taking 3 million lives with him. On the command deck, High Arbiter Thrax closed his eyes, his mandibles clicking in a final rhythmic prayer of his people. Caleb Voss didn't move. He stood with one hand on Bones' collar, watching the incoming kamikaze strike on the main view screen. He looked like a man watching a minor rainstorm through a window, not a civilization-ending collision. "Elias," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the blaring alarms. "Execute the audit." The Old Earth Vanguard supercarrier, a mountain of dark metal floating in the distance, didn't fire its main cannons. It didn't launch interceptors. Instead, it emitted a single focused beam of coherent gravitons. To the observers on the station, it looked like the air itself around the Vengeance of Zyle had turned into liquid glass. The rogue cruiser didn't explode. It simply stopped. In less than a millisecond, its velocity went from 10,000 kilometers per hour to 0. The kinetic energy was bled off into the station's own heat sinks, a feat of engineering that defied every known law of Zyrinthian physics. "Kinetic debt settled," Elias reported, his fingers dancing across the hijacked consoles. "The rogue ship has been boarded by human maintenance teams. The reactor is stable." Caleb turned his back on the view screen and looked down at Thrax, who was still huddled on the floor, trembling. The mighty High Arbiter looked small now, diminished by the realization that he had spent his entire life bullying a species that had been holding its breath to keep from shattering the galaxy. "This is the settlement," Caleb said, his voice cold and clinical. "The Zyrinthian Sovereignty is dissolved. Your assets are being liquidated to pay for the emotional and physical damages caused to the human sector. Your planet cracker will be dismantled and turned into a deep space research station for the Galactic Council. The real council. The one where the back row finally gets a vote." He began walking toward the hangar bay, Bones trotting faithfully at his side. The Zyrinthian elites, the guards who had once viewed Caleb as a primitive pet, stepped aside in a wave of silence. They didn't just fear him. They were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the deception. They realized that every time a human had smiled at them, every time a human had apologized for being in the way, it had been an act of supreme mercy. "Where are you going?" Thrax croaked, his voice barely audible over the sound of human transport ships docking with the station. "You've destroyed everything. Who will lead us? Who will maintain order?" Caleb paused at the blast doors, looking back over his shoulder. The red emergency lighting cast long, jagged shadows across his face, making him look less like a pilot and more like a vengeful deity from a forgotten age. "We aren't here to lead you, Thrax," Caleb said. "We're just the janitors. We're going to clean up the mess you made, and then we're going back to our quiet moons and our primitive dome houses. We like our peace. We like our privacy. And we really like our friends." He looked at Bones, who let out a sharp, happy bark that echoed through the hollow halls of the dying empire. "But from now on," Caleb added, his eyes narrowing, "whenever you see a human in a plaid shirt mopping a floor or filing a trade report, you remember today. You remember that we are patient because we choose to be. And you remember that if you ever touch what's ours again, we won't just audit your empire. We'll delete it from the ledger." 6 months later, the galaxy was a different place. The Zyrinthian worlds were thriving under a new, decentralized trade federation, overseen by economists in simple suits. Peace was maintained not by grand armadas, but by a shared understanding of the Annoyance Protocol. On the frozen moon of Frost 7, the red dust had finally settled. A new, larger shack stood where the old one had been scorched. Caleb Voss sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the triple suns set over the permafrost. Beside him, Bones lay in the dirt, chewing on a new, high-tensile rubber toy that had been a gift from the new Galactic Council. A small transport ship landed nearby. A young Zyrinthian official, part of the new diplomatic corps, stepped out. He was carrying a stack of digital tablets, looking nervous as he approached the porch. He stopped 10 paces away, bowed deeply, and waited to be acknowledged. "Mr. Voss," the official said, his voice shaking. "The council has a question regarding the new tax brackets for the Orion sector." Caleb took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He didn't look up. He just patted Bones on the head. "I'm on vacation," Caleb said quietly. "Is this an emergency?" The official looked at the dog, then at the man who had brought down an empire for that dog. He took a step back, his mandibles clicking in a hasty retreat. "No, sir, not an emergency at all. Figure it out. Please, enjoy your rest." As the ship took off, Caleb leaned back in his chair, a small, tired smile touching his lips. The galaxy had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Humanity was the kindest species in the stars, right up until the moment they weren't. And as long as the dog was happy, the stars would stay in the sky.